Think your grocery bill is high? Medieval peasants didn't have grocery stores. They had dirt, disease, and the very real possibility that this winter might be their last. Their survival depended on eating things we'd throw in the garbage today, and they did it every single day for 1,000 years. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval food. It wasn't romantic. There were no cozy tavern meals with roasted chickens and frothing mugs of ale, at least not for the 85% of Europe's population who qualified as peasants. These people ate to survive, nothing more. A medieval farm worker burned through 4,000 to 5,000 calories daily just staying alive through backbreaking labor. Finding those calories meant eating whatever grew, whatever could be foraged, and whatever parts of animals the rich people didn't want. The meals we're about to explore kept entire civilizations alive through plague, famine, and endless war. Some of these foods you've heard of, most you haven't, and a few will make you grateful you were born in the age of refrigeration. We're starting with the simplest survival food ever invented, then working our way through 20 meals that defined medieval existence, ending with the most desperate measures people took when everything else ran out. Let's begin with gruel, because nothing says medieval misery quite like boiled grain water. Take ground oats, rye, wheat, or rice. Add a massive amount of boiling water. That's it. That's the recipe. The result was a thin, watery liquid with barely more substance than flavored water. It tasted like nothing, provided minimal nutrition, and represented the absolute bottom of the medieval food chain. But here's the genius of gruel. 1 cup of grain could feed several people. During the famines that struck Europe every few decades, this arithmetic meant the difference between life and death. Monasteries feeding the poor would stretch a single cup of oats into gruel, serving 10 people. That's less than 2 tablespoons of actual grain per person. Not a meal by any definition, but enough to keep a body functioning for another day. The preparation process itself revealed the desperation behind gruel. You'd start with whatever grain fragments remained at the bottom of storage containers, often mixed with chaff and bits of straw. These would be ground as fine as possible using stone mortars, a task that fell to children or the elderly, since it required hours of repetitive pounding, but not much. Strength. The finer you ground the grain, the more it would expand in water, stretching your supplies further. The water-to-grain ratio was crucial. Too little water, and you'd create a thick porridge that couldn't feed enough mouths. Too much, and the mixture became so thin that it provided almost no sustenance at all. Medieval cooks aimed for a consistency where you could see through the liquid if you held it up to light, but it still had a slight cloudiness that indicated some nutritional content remained. Medieval monks ate gruel twice daily during Lent. Their version occasionally included honey or dried fruit, luxuries that regular peasants never saw. For everyone else, gruel meant survival rations. The sick and elderly who couldn't chew solid food lived on it. Babies being weaned from breast milk went straight to gruel, often with disastrous results. Court records from medieval England document children dying of malnutrition despite being fed gruel regularly, which tells you everything about its nutritional inadequacy. The taste. One medieval writer noted that even dogs turn from it unless truly starving. The texture was worse than the flavor. A slimy, slightly gritty liquid that coated your mouth and throat. You could feel it sliding down, leaving an unpleasant film that no amount of water could wash away. People who ate gruel for extended periods often developed sores in their mouths from the constant irritation of the grain particles. But during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when rain destroyed crops across Europe for 2 straight years, gruel kept millions alive. In the worst times, chestnuts or acorns were ground into flour for the gruel, adding a bitter edge to an already unpleasant experience. Some desperate families even added sawdust to bulk up their gruel, though this provided zero nutrition and could cause serious digestive problems. The ritual of eating gruel became a marker of social status. In monasteries, gruel was served in individual wooden bowls, consumed in silence as part of religious discipline. In peasant homes, entire families might eat from a single communal pot, taking turns with a shared wooden spoon. The poorest families had no spoons at all, simply tilting the pot to their lips and drinking directly, burns from the hot liquid being a common hazard. Now let's talk about pottage, the meal that defined medieval peasant life more than any other. This wasn't just soup. It was a constantly evolving pot of thick stew that sat over the fire for days or weeks at a time. You'd ladle out a bowl, then throw new ingredients back in. The pot rarely cooled, rarely emptied, and represented the closest thing to continuous food security a medieval family could achieve. The base started with whatever grain was cheapest, barley, oats, or rye, boiled until they broke down into a thick porridge consistency. This initial cooking process took hours, You couldn't just dump grain in water and walk away. The mixture required constant stirring to prevent burning, which would ruin the entire batch and waste precious food. This stirring duty typically fell to children, who would spend hours by the fire with a long wooden spoon, keeping the contents moving. From there, peasants added whatever vegetables they could grow or forage: turnips, onions, leeks, cabbage, carrots if they were lucky, peas when available. The order of addition mattered. Root vegetables went in first because they took longest to soften. Leafy greens went in last, sometimes just minutes before eating, to prevent them from dissolving into mush. This wasn't written knowledge passed down in cookbooks. This was experiential learning, the kind mothers taught daughters by the fire, year after year. Archaeological evidence from medieval village sites shows that during winter, pottage ingredients shrank to just grains and root vegetables. Summer brought more variety, but the concept remained constant. Throw everything edible into one pot and keep it cooking. The pot itself became a family heirloom, passed down through generations. Made of iron or copper, these cooking vessels were expensive enough that they appeared in wills alongside land and livestock. Studies of medieval food remains found that the average peasant household kept their pottage going for at least 4 days before starting fresh. Many families maintained their pot much longer. The trick was managing the fire temperature. Too hot, and the bottom would scorch. Too cool, and the contents would sour. Experienced cooks could judge the right heat by holding their hand near the pot, feeling for that perfect warmth that kept everything bubbling gently without boiling over. Some historians believe medieval peasants consumed 2 to 3 pints of pottage daily. That's 6 to 9 cups of soup per person every single day. It was the fuel of the feudal system, providing the calories needed for 12-hour workdays in the fields. Workers would often eat a bowl before dawn, another at midday, brought to them in the fields, and a third after returning home at dusk. The wealthy ate pottage too, but theirs looked completely different. Noble households enhanced their pottage with imported spices, bits of meat, and wine. Saffron alone cost more than most peasants earned in a month. A single thread of this golden spice could transform a pot of vegetables into something that smelled and tasted exotic. Peasant pottage relied on local herbs for flavor: garlic, parsley, sage, whatever grew nearby. These herbs didn't just add taste, they also helped preserve the pottage, their natural antimicrobial properties keeping the mixture safe to eat for longer periods. On special occasions, maybe after a successful hunt, or when the lord distributed meat as payment, a peasant family might drop a small piece of salt pork or bacon into their pot. Not enough to make a meat dish, but just enough to infuse the entire batch with flavor. The fat would rise to the top, creating a thin layer that helped seal the pottage from air and extended its keeping time. This layer of fat was so precious that families would carefully skim it off and save it separately, using it to grease pans or add richness to other dishes. One cookbook from the late 1300s, written by a master cook for King Richard II, includes a pottage recipe requiring cabbages, minced onions, white of leeks cut small, saffron, and salt. That's the fancy version. The cookbook specified exact measurements and cooking times, a luxury peasants never had. They cooked by feel, by smell, by the look of the bubbles on the surface. Peasant pottage was whatever you had, boiled until soft. Another recipe from the 1430s describes apple muse, a sweet pottage made by boiling apples, straining them, adding almond milk, honey, grated bread, saffron, sandalwood, and salt. The recipe instructs cooks to see that you stir it well and serve forth. These sweet versions existed, but regular folks rarely tasted them. Almonds were imported luxuries. Sandalwood was worth its weight in silver. These ingredients existed in a different culinary universe than the one peasants inhabited. The French had their own pottage tradition. One manuscript from around 1300 includes 27 pages of different thickened pottage recipes. The Parisian Household Book from 1393 organizes pottages under categories, with or without spices, thickened or not thickened. This systematic approach shows how central pottage was to medieval cooking across all social classes. The difference wasn't whether you ate pottage, it was what kind of pottage you could afford. Thickening agents separated peasant pottage from wealthy versions. Noble households used egg yolks, which created a rich, creamy texture. They used breadcrumbs made from fine white bread. Peasants used whatever they had, sometimes a handful of oats stirred in at the end, sometimes crushed beans, sometimes just cooking it longer until the natural starches thickened the mixture on their own. But pottage required grain, and grain had to be turned into something more substantial. Enter bread, the absolute foundation foundation of medieval existence. Everyone ate bread, rich and poor alike. The difference was what kind. White bread made from wheat flour indicated wealth and status. Dark, dense bread made from rye or barley marked you as a peasant, and that division wasn't subtle. Rye bread was the peasant standard across northern Europe. Rye is a hardy grain that grows in poor soil and survives beneath snow cover. The bread made from rye flour didn't rise as well as wheat bread, coming out dense and heavy. A loaf of rye bread could weigh 3 to 4 pounds and had a texture closer to what we'd call a brick than modern bread, but it kept peasants alive, and the rye straw could be used for animal bedding, roofing material, and even building work. Nothing went to waste. The growing cycle of rye made it perfect for northern climates. You planted in fall, it survived winter under snow, and you harvested in early summer. This timing meant rye was often the first grain available after the lean months of late winter and spring, a period historians call the Hungry Gap, when last year's stores ran low and new crops hadn't matured yet. A working man consumed 2 to 3 pounds of bread daily. Women and children ate proportionally similar amounts. This wasn't gluttony. This was the caloric math of survival. Bread provided over 60% of total calories for the average medieval person. When you're burning 4,000 calories a day just staying alive, you eat a lot of bread. The sheer volume is hard to imagine today. Picture eating an entire large loaf of dense, heavy bread every single day, day after day, year after year. Medieval governments understood this arithmetic. In 13th century England, the assize of bread forced bakers to produce a loaf that could be sold for a penny, ensuring the poor could afford it. The size of that penny loaf depended on how the harvest went. Good harvest meant bigger loaves, sometimes weighing over 2 pounds. Poor harvest meant smaller ones, shrinking to barely a pound. This system created a direct link between agricultural success and basic survival. You could judge the state of the kingdom by the size of the penny loaf. Bakers who violated these regulations faced harsh punishment. Being caught selling underweight loaves could result in fines, time in the pillory, or even banishment from the Bakers' Guild. Some towns kept official weights in the marketplace where customers could verify their purchases. The tension between bakers trying to maximize profit and authorities trying to prevent bread riots created a constant struggle that defined urban medieval life. The baking process revealed medieval class divisions starkly. Wealthy households enjoyed fresh bread daily, baked in private ovens by personal servants. Peasants lacking private ovens baked just once a week in communal village ovens or made flatbreads on hearthstones. These weekly loaves grew progressively harder and moldier as days passed, requiring a dunk in pottage or ale to become edible again by week's end. Communal ovens operated on strict schedules. Each family had designated times when they could use the oven, usually determined by social status and how much they paid to the lord who owned it. You'd prepare your dough at home, carry it to the communal oven, wait your turn, and then monitor your loaves carefully because theft was common. Women would literally sit by the oven entrance, guarding their bread while it baked. Then there was horse bread, a flatbread made with bran held together with rye flour and given to horses. Sometimes straw and sweepings from the bakery floor got added to make it go further. This wasn't a euphemism. They literally swept up the flour dust, chaff, and debris from the bakery floor and mixed it into the dough. The horses needed their protein too, apparently, though calling sawdust and straw protein is generous. This bread was regulated under the same rules as human bread, showing how seriously medieval authorities took bread production. And when horse bread was baked without the floor muck, struggling peasants ate it. There's something profound about being so hungry that food meant for animals becomes your dinner. Court records occasionally mention disputes over horse bread, with starving families accused of stealing from stables. Gentleman farmer named Gervase Markham wrote in 1615 about brown bread for the lowest employees of households, meaning farm workers. He described it as the coarsest bread for man's use, made with ground peas, barley, and either wheat or rye. The ingredients should be mixed with boiling water because the hotter your liqueur is, the less of the smell or rankness of the peas be received. In other words, boiling water helped mask the unpleasant taste and smell of cheap ingredients. This pea-packed brown bread was standard fare for rural peasants, providing the dense calories needed for strenuous work. The texture was incredibly coarse. Bits of pea hull would get stuck between your teeth. The bread didn't slice cleanly, but rather crumbled and broke apart. You couldn't make a sandwich with this bread. You just tore off chunks and chewed until you could swallow. A clergyman named William Harrison, writing in 1577, openly described brown bread bread as the worst and weakest, only fit for servants, slaves, and the inferior kind of people to feed upon, because it is dry and brickle. Brickle meant brittle or easily crumbled. Harrison wrote this with obvious disdain, but his description is actually useful. We know that peasant bread was so dry and hard that it literally crumbled like brittle material. But despite its coarse texture and implied inferiority, this bread was essential. It delivered calories, it could be stored, it could be eaten while working. These practical concerns mattered more than taste or texture. A piece of brown bread tucked into your shirt could sustain you through hours of field work. You didn't need to stop, sit down, or use utensils. You just bit off chunks between tasks. The most dangerous aspect of medieval bread was ergot, a naturally occurring fungus that infected rye. Ergot contains compounds similar to LSD. Entire villages sometimes experienced mass hallucinations, convulsions, and death from what was called St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms were horrific: burning sensations in limbs, convulsions, hallucinations, and eventually gangrene as blood flow to extremities shut down. Fingers and toes would turn black and fall off. They had no idea their daily bread was to blame. They thought it was divine punishment, witchcraft, or disease. The connection between contaminated rye and these symptoms wouldn't be understood for centuries, so people kept eating ergot-infected bread because the alternative was starving. Some historians believe ergot poisoning may have contributed to some of the more bizarre episodes of medieval history, including certain witch trial testimonies where accusers described fantastic visions. During times of desperate hunger, people ate moldy, contaminated bread because the alternative was starving. You'd scrape off the visible mold and eat what remained. You'd toast bread that had gone completely hard and hope the heat killed whatever was making it smell bad. Medieval people knew this bread could make them sick, but hunger overpowered caution. Beyond bread and pottage, peasants needed variety to survive psychologically, if not nutritionally. Oats provided that variety. Gervase Markham described oats as the cheapest grain of that goodness and hardness that it will grow in any soil, as if nature had made it the only loving companion and friend to mankind. This wasn't just poetic language. Oats genuinely thrived where other grains failed. Oats could grow in waterlogged soil that would rot wheat roots. They could survive in sandy soil that couldn't hold enough moisture for barley. They matured quickly enough for northern regions with short growing seasons. All of this made oats the ultimate survival grain for areas where nothing else would grow. For a poor man's stew called girt brew, Markham recommended oatmeal steeped in water mixed with coarse meat. Being harder to digest, it was said to be suitable only for those with strong, able stomachs, and such whose toil and much sweat both liberally spendeth evil humors. In other words, only people doing hard physical labor could properly digest this stuff. The wealthy with their sedentary lifestyles would supposedly get sick from such heavy, difficult food. This reveals a medieval medical belief that digestive capability correlated with physical labor. The theory held that hard work generated internal heat that helped break down tough foods. Therefore, laborers could eat things that would make gentlefolk ill. Whether this had any medical validity is doubtful, but it justified serving the worst food to people who worked the hardest. Oat cakes were the perfect field food. Full of carbs and calories, these biscuit-like flatbreads needed just 3 ingredients: ground oats, water, and a pinch of salt. They could be baked on hot stones, foregoing the need for an oven that most peasant homes lacked. The preparation was simple enough that even children could make them. Mix ground oats with just enough water to form a thick paste, flatten it into thin rounds, and cook on hot stones or directly on the hearth until crisp. The result was a hard, dry cracker that could last for weeks without spoiling. Workers would tuck these oatcakes into pockets or pouches, pulling them out during brief breaks from labor. Unlike bread, which would crumble into useless fragments, oatcakes held together. You could gnaw on one while walking, while plowing, while doing almost anything. A French chronicler traveling to England in 1327 joined the campaign to the Scottish borders. In his chronicles, he stated that each Scottish soldier carried a big flat stone between the seat and paddle of his saddle so that he could throw the flat stone on the fire and make little pancakes like the communion wafers made by the nuns. He added, "So it's no wonder the Scots cover more ground each day than the others do." This observation was military intelligence disguised as cultural commentary. The Scottish Army's mobility advantage advantage came partly from their portable food system. English soldiers relied on supply trains carrying bread and other provisions. Scottish soldiers carried oats and a cooking stone, making food wherever they camped. This logistical difference could determine the outcome of campaigns, but bread and oats alone don't provide complete nutrition. Medieval peasants needed protein, which brings us to peas and beans, the unsung heroes of medieval survival. These humble legumes provided what bread and cabbage couldn't: genuine protein. Dried peas contained about 25% protein by weight, making them incredibly valuable during winter when meat was scarce or non-existent. A small patch of peas could yield up to 60 pounds of dried peas, enough to help a family through the leanest months. The growing process was straightforward. Plant in early spring, provide some kind of support for the vines to climb, and harvest in midsummer. Then spread the pea pods in the sun to dry completely before shelling out the peas for storage. Even better, peas and beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, meaning they could grow in fields where other crops had depleted the nutrients. Smart peasants planted them between rows of other vegetables or after harvesting grain, getting extra food from the same land. This practice, called crop rotation, wasn't understood scientifically, but was discovered through generations of trial and error. The most common preparation was mashed. After elitsar, soaking dried peas or beans overnight to rehydrate them, peasants boiled them until soft, then mashed them into a thick paste. This process took hours. Dried peas don't soften quickly, even with soaking. You'd simmer them all morning to have them ready for the midday meal. Salt was added, if available, maybe wild herbs, if they were lucky. The result looked like baby food, but packed a nutritional punch that kept workers going through 12-hour days. The texture was thick and gluey, coating your mouth in a way that wasn't entirely pleasant, but was filling. A small bowl of pea mash sat heavy in your stomach, suppressing hunger for hours. During the Great Famine, records from one English village note that families survived for weeks on nothing but pea mash and small beer, with bread becoming a luxury. When grain supplies ran out completely, pea mash became the only thing standing between life and starvation. People ate it morning, noon, and night, day after day, until fresh crops came in. Monks across Europe relied heavily on these foods too. Church rules banned meat on many days, sometimes more than half the calendar, making peas and beans vital to monastery kitchens. Account books from one large abbey show they stocked over 3,000 pounds of dried peas yearly for just 40 monks. That's 75 pounds per monk annually, or more than 4 ounces of dried peas per monk per day. These monastery records are invaluable because monks kept detailed accounts. We know exactly what they ate and when. While their diet was better than peasants, the reliance on legumes was universal. The church's fasting rules actually created a kind of protein crisis that legumes solved. Without peas and beans, medieval Christianity's dietary restrictions would have been unsustainable. Storage was another huge advantage. While fresh peas and beans lasted only days, dried versions kept for years if stored properly. Peasant homes often had clay pots or wooden barrels of dried legumes tucked away as insurance against bad harvests. These stores represented wealth and security. A family with barrels of dried peas could survive a failed harvest. A family without them faced starvation. One archaeological dig found peas still in storage pots from 10 years earlier, still technically edible, if not exactly tasty. The peas had darkened and would require even longer cooking, but they retained nutritional value. This longevity made dried legumes one of the few foods you could save for true emergencies. The downside? Same as cabbage, these foods cause serious gas. Medieval health guides warned against eating too many beans before church services or court appearances. The flatulence was not just embarrassing, but actually painful when consuming large quantities of legumes daily. But when the alternative was starvation, a little flatulence seemed a reasonable trade-off. Vegetables rounded out the medieval diet, with turnips playing a starring role. These humble roots thrived in conditions that would kill other crops. Poor soil, turnips thrived. Short growing season, turnips managed. Little attention from busy farmers, turnips forgave the neglect. A single turnip seed could yield up to 15 pounds of food, making them among the most efficient crops a peasant could plant. The growing cycle was remarkably forgiving. Plant turnip seeds in early summer, and they'd be ready to harvest by fall. Unlike grain that required extensive preparation of fields, turnips could grow in rough, barely cultivated ground. They'd push through soil that was more clay than earth, sending handing down roots that broke up compacted ground. Turnip stew became the medieval equivalent of fast food, quick, filling, and available year-round. The recipe required minimal effort. Chop turnips, add water, boil until soft. Season with salt if available. Done. No fancy techniques, no rare ingredients, just pure sustenance. The cooking time was about an hour, much faster than the all-day simmering required for tougher ingredients. Storage was another turnip superpower. Long before refrigeration, medieval peasants stored turnips in cool, dry cellars where they remained edible for months. Some villages dug specialized turnip pits, underground storage chambers lined with straw, where turnips kept fresh from harvest until late spring. The construction of these pits followed a specific technique. Dig down about 4 feet, line the sides with stone or wood, layer straw on the bottom, pile in turnips, cover with more straw, then cap with earth. Records from one English manor in 1286 noted that turnips stored this way fed village families for 7 months after harvest. This long storage period meant turnips bridged the hungry gap between winter and spring when little else was available. In March and April, when last year's grain was running out and this year's crops hadn't matured, turnips kept people alive. Unlike many vegetables, the entire turnip was edible. Roots went into stews, leaves were added to pottage, and even the flowers could be eaten in spring. Nothing went to waste. The greens were actually more nutritious than the roots, packed with vitamins that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Medieval field records suggest that a family of 4 needed to grow about 200 pounds of turnips to survive winter, a goal achievable in a surprisingly small garden plot. You could grow this quantity in a space about 20 feet by 20 feet, much smaller than the area needed to grow an equivalent caloric amount of grain. Of course, eating turnips day after day had downsides. Medieval writers occasionally complained about the sameness of peasant meals, with one noting that the poor eat turnips until their skin takes on the pallor of the root itself. This wasn't entirely metaphorical. A diet consisting primarily of turnips could give skin a yellowish tinge from the beta-carotene content. Another drawback was less aesthetic and more aromatic. Turnips, especially when reheated repeatedly, developed a distinctive smell that permeated medieval homes. The smell is hard to describe to modern noses, a combination of sweet earthiness when fresh that turns increasingly sulfurous and cabbage-like when old. Homes where turnip stew had been reheated multiple times would reek of it, the smell seeping into wooden furniture and clothing. Cabbage and onions formed another vegetable duo that appeared constantly in peasant cooking. A single cabbage plant could grow massive, with heads weighing up to 15 pounds. Agricultural records show that 10 cabbage plants could feed a family for months, taking up minimal garden space. The outer leaves could be picked throughout the growing season, while the center kept growing, like food that replaced itself as you ate it. This regenerative quality made cabbage incredibly valuable. Rather than harvesting the entire plant at once, you'd peel off outer leaves as needed. The plant would continue growing from the center, producing new leaves. A single cabbage plant could provide food for weeks before you finally harvested the head. Preservation made cabbage truly valuable. Fresh cabbage lasted weeks in cool storage, but soured cabbage, what we now call sauerkraut, kept for months. The fermentation process was simple. Shred cabbage, pack it tightly in barrels with salt, weight it down, and let it sit for weeks. The salt drew moisture from the cabbage, creating a brine. Natural bacteria fermented the sugars, creating lactic acid that preserved the cabbage and gave it that characteristic sour taste. Archaeologists found medieval cabbage pits in village sites where people let cabbage ferment. One excavated pit from a 1300s village had leftover bits from over 100 cabbages preserved together, enough to feed several families all winter. The scale of these operations shows how central fermented cabbage was to winter survival. Onions worked perfectly alongside cabbage in medieval cooking. Tough and hard to kill, they grew in the worst soil and stored without any special tools. You could literally pile onions in a corner of a dry room, and they'd keep for months. Medieval gardening manuals told people to plant onions around other crops to keep bugs away, making them twice as useful in small peasant gardens where every bit of space mattered. Together, these vegetables turned plain food into something with actual taste. Boiled together, they made a simple side dish. Added to pottage, they gave more flavor. Mixed with tiny bits of meat, they became a feast. Medieval tax records sometimes list cabbage and onions as acceptable payment for small debts, showing how much people valued them daily. The digestive troubles from these vegetables were well known. Medieval court records from various villages mention problems caused by excessive gas after cabbage meals. One monastery rule banned cabbage on days when monks had important visitors, suggesting the flatulence afterward wasn't good for polite company. This rule appeared in multiple monastery guidelines, indicating the problem was universal enough to require official policy. Oddly enough, medieval doctors didn't trust vegetables. Wealthy people's physicians often warned nobles not to eat poor people plants, like cabbage, claiming they made you sad and slow thinking. Medical texts from the period describe vegetables as cold and moist, supposedly disrupting the body's balance of humors. The wealthy were advised to eat meat and white bread instead. Meanwhile, the poor folks eating these vegetables every day lived on far less food than the rich, and probably had fewer of the diet-related illnesses that wealthy people often suffered. The wealthy died of gout, obesity-related conditions, and heart problems from their rich diets. The poor died of malnutrition, but not the diseases of excess. When vegetables weren't enough, peasants turned to meat, or more accurately, to the parts of animals nobody else wanted. Medieval butchering followed strict hierarchies about who got what parts. The lord of the manor claimed the best cuts: tenderloins, plump breasts, meaty haunches. Town folks with money bought the decent, middle-grade pieces. What remained for peasants? Everything else. Take the humble pig head. After a pig slaughter, peasant families often received the head as partial payment for their work. This wasn't generosity. The lord got multiple pigs worth of prime cuts, while the peasants got one head between several families. But those peasants made that head count. Nothing went unused. The cheeks provided small but tender meat portions, considered delicacies even today in some cuisines. The ears were cleaned, sliced, and fried crisp, creating crunchy treats. The snout and lips went into jellied dishes, boiled until the collagen broke down into gelatin. Even the brain was scooped out and scrambled like eggs, though this required eating it quickly before spoilage set in. Cow stomachs, cleaned and boiled, became containers for haggis-like mixtures of grain and bits of heart or liver. The cleaning process was elaborate and unpleasant, involving turning the stomach inside out, scraping away the inner lining, and soaking it multiple times. But the result was a natural cooking vessel that could be stuffed with other ingredients and boiled. Sheep lungs, sliced thin and fried with onions, offered a quick meal after butchering day. Lungs had a spongy texture that some people found off-putting, but when cooked properly, they became crispy on the edges while remaining soft in the middle. The key was slicing them thin enough that they'd crisp up rather than staying rubbery. Blood from any animal became blood pudding when mixed with grain and cooked in a cleaned intestine casing. The process had to be done immediately after slaughter, before the blood coagulated. Mix blood with oats or barley. Add some fat if available. Season with herbs, stuff into intestines, and boil. The result was a sausage that was essentially congealed blood held together with grain. Medieval records reveal how valuable these scraps were. Theft of offal was punished severely, sometimes with the same penalties as stealing more valuable cuts. One medieval English town recorded fining a man for stealing a sheep's pluck, the heart, liver, and lungs, equal to 2 weeks' wages. This penalty reveals that offal had real economic value, not just nutritional value. Preservation techniques for offal were necessarily quick. Without refrigeration, organs spoiled rapidly. Smoking, salting, and immediate cooking were the only options. Many offal dishes became linked to butchering days, eaten within hours of the animal's slaughter in an almost ceremonial fashion. Entire communities would gather when an animal was slaughtered, each family receiving their portion of the offal to prepare immediately. For people living near coasts or rivers, another protein source swam within reach. Salted herring became the fast food of the Middle Ages, ready to eat without cooking and packed with enough salt to make you thirsty for days. Herring swam in huge schools, were easy to catch, and could be preserved with simple salt. Fishing records from medieval times show just how massive the herring industry was. During peak season, a single fishing fleet from Great Yarmouth in England could haul in more than 40 million herring in just a few weeks. That's enough fish to give every person in medieval England 7 fish each. The scale of these operations was industrial before industrialization existed. The salt preservation process was quick but smelly work. Fresh herring spoiled within a day, so fishing boats often carried salt on board. Workers gutted the fish, packed them in heavy salt, and stored them in wooden barrels right on the deck. The smell was so strong that herring processing areas of medieval towns had their own districts, safely downwind from where most people lived. Property values in these districts were significantly lower than elsewhere in town. For peasants, salted herring solved multiple problems. First, it addressed the meat ban during religious fasting days. The church banned meat on Fridays, during Lent, and on many other holy days, sometimes totaling more than half the year. Fish remained allowed, making herring a crucial protein source. Without herring, many people would have struggled to get adequate protein during fasting periods. Second, herring could travel far from the coast without spoiling. Packed in barrels, these fish reached deep inland where fresh fish never could. Trade records show barrels of herring moving hundreds of miles from the sea, reaching mountain villages and remote farms. This created a truly national food supply chain centuries before modern transportation. Third, no cooking needed. The heavily salted version could be eaten as is, a medieval version of ready-to-eat food. For busy peasants working from dawn to dusk, a quick meal of herring and bread saved precious time and fuel. You could eat herring while walking, while working, while doing almost anything. Tax records tell an amazing story about consumption. The small Baltic island of Scania processed more than 300 million herring annually in peak years. A single monastery in York bought 15,000 herring yearly to feed just 30 monks. That's 500 fish per monk per year, or more than one herring every single day. These numbers seem impossible until you realize herring was essentially the only protein source available during half the year. After a salty meal, medieval peasants needed something to wash it down. Water in medieval times could be deadly. Wells were often dug too close to outhouses. Rivers caught sewage from upstream towns, and most people had no idea that dirty water could make you sick. They just knew that people who drank from certain water sources often fell ill, while those who stuck to ale stayed healthy. The brewing process accidentally solved this problem. Boiling the water killed harmful germs, and the alcohol helped prevent new ones from growing. Medieval people didn't understand the science, but they saw the results clearly. Ale drinkers were healthier than water drinkers. This observation was so consistent that drinking water was actually considered strange and potentially dangerous behavior. Ale in medieval times wasn't strong. Small ale contained just enough alcohol to preserve it, about 1–3%, similar to modern light beer. This weak brew was an everyday drink for everyone, including children. Yes, medieval kids drank ale with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but they weren't stumbling around drunk. It was more like drinking very flavorful water with a slight buzz. How much did the average person drink? Medieval records tell an amazing story. Many adult workers received ale allowances of a gallon per day. That's 8 pints, or 128 ounces. For context, that's more than 10 modern cans of beer daily. Manor records show that during harvest time, when work was hardest, this might increase to 1.5 gallons. The constant drinking was partly hydration and partly caloric intake. Brewing was usually women's work, done right at home. The basic recipe was simple. Heat water, add malted grain, strain out the grain, add flavor with herbs, then let it ferment. Most women brewed once or twice a week, making the family supply before storing it in pottery jugs or wooden barrels. This was labor-intensive work. Heating enough water to make a week's worth of ale required maintaining a fire for hours. The physical effort of lifting heavy pots and stirring thick grain mixtures made brewing genuinely exhausting. Ale spoiled quickly without refrigeration, usually within a week. This meant it was truly local food, made and consumed within the same community. It also meant brewing was a constant chore for medieval households, as necessary and regular as making bread. You couldn't brew a month's supply and be done with it. You had to brew every week without fail because your family needed it to survive. For special occasions, peasants might enjoy stronger drinks. Cider became the drink of choice in areas where apples grew well. Apple trees had major advantages for peasant farmers. Once planted, they produced fruit for decades with minimal care. Even better, they could grow on hillsides too steep for regular crops, making use of otherwise wasted land. A hillside orchard didn't compete with grain fields for valuable flat farmland. Making cider involved simple tools and basic steps. Peasants collected apples, crushed them in wooden presses, collected the juice, and left it to ferment naturally. The wild yeasts on apple skins started fermentation without any help. After a few weeks, the sweet juice transformed into a mildly alcoholic drink that could keep for months, much longer than the apples themselves would have lasted. Strong cider contained about 4 to 8% alcohol, enough to feel good after a few cups, but not so strong that workers couldn't function the next day. Weaker versions were everyday drinks, while stronger batches were saved for special occasions like weddings and harvest festivals. The distinction mattered. You wouldn't waste strong cider on daily drinking when weak ale would do. Mead offered an even sweeter escape. Made by fermenting honey with water, mead was the oldest known alcoholic drink in Europe. However, honey was expensive and hard to get, making mead much rarer than ale or cider for average peasants. Most peasants only tasted mead a few times a year, usually at Christmas, Easter, or when celebrating weddings. Some clever peasants kept their own beehives, providing honey for both sweetening food and making small batches of mead. A single hive could produce 15-20 pounds of honey yearly, enough for a family to make a few gallons of mead and still have honey for other uses. But beekeeping required knowledge and equipment that not everyone possessed. Honey stood as the king of sweeteners in the medieval world. Unlike sugar, which remained firmly in the realm of the wealthy, honey could be produced locally, though not without risk. Brave peasants gathered wild honey by following bees to their hives, smoking them to reduce stinging, and cutting out honeycomb chunks. This dangerous work often resulted in multiple stings, but yielded liquid gold that made the pain worthwhile. The process of gathering wild honey was genuinely dangerous. Bees defend their hives aggressively, and medieval people had no protective gear. Multiple bee stings could trigger severe allergic reactions. Deaths from honey gathering were rare, but not unknown. Yet people continued doing it because honey was that valuable. Medieval medical guides recommended honey for healing wounds, soothing coughs, and preserving other medicines. Village records sometimes list beehives as valuable enough to include in wills and marriage contracts alongside land and livestock. A good beehive could be worth as much as a cow, which puts the value in perspective. When berries and honey weren't available, medieval peasants sometimes found other foods to fill hungry bellies. Chestnuts and acorns became crucial backup foods when grain supplies ran low, turning forests into emergency pantries. Chestnuts were easier to use than many alternatives. Unlike acorns, chestnuts taste sweet naturally and don't require extensive processing. In areas with chestnut forests, especially parts of France, Italy, and Spain, chestnuts became known as the bread tree because they provided starchy nutrition similar to grain. A good chestnut harvest could save a village from winter hunger. Medieval peasants prepared chestnuts in several ways. Roasting was simplest. Just toss them in hot ashes until the shells cracked open. The smell of roasting chestnuts would fill medieval homes during fall and winter. Boiling removed more of the tannic acid and made them easier to digest. For long-term storage, chestnuts were often dried and ground into flour that could be mixed with grain flour to stretch bread supplies. Acorns required much more work but could save lives during famine. The bitter tannins in raw acorns make them inedible without processing. Medieval peasants developed methods to remove these bitter compounds, usually by repeatedly soaking crushed acorns in water. The process took days and used lots of water, but the hobios resulting acorn meal could be mixed with grain flour to make barely palatable emergency bread. The forest provided more than nuts. Medieval wild food gathering followed the changing seasons. Spring brought tender young greens like dandelions, nettles, and sorrel that appeared when food stores were often at their lowest. Young nettles, despite their sting, were among the most valuable spring finds, packed with vitamins and minerals after the long winter diet of grain and preserved foods. When even wild plants became scarce, desperate times called for desperate measures. Ash cakes represented the last line of defense against starvation. The concept was brutally simple. Take whatever ground meal you had, mix it with water to form a thick paste, flatten it into a patty, and cook it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. In the harshest times, medieval peasants turned to true improvisation. The best medieval dish wasn't actually a dish at all. It was simply whatever bits and pieces happened to be around, thrown together in a pot, and called dinner. Medieval peasants were masters of kitchen improvisation. This whatever we have approach wasn't just common, it was daily life for most families. These 20 meals kept civilizations running for 1,000 years. They weren't glamorous, they weren't Instagram-worthy, but they worked. Every time you complain about your grocery bill or turn your nose up at leftovers, remember, your ancestors survived on boiled grain water, turnip stew, and bread made from sweepings off the bakery floor. They made it work because they had to, and because they did, you're here today. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on one of the boxes playing on your screen to watch more similar content.